The call came at 2:47 in the morning, and Petra Harlow almost didn't answer it. She was sitting in the hospital parking lot, still in her scrubs, too tired to drive and too wired to sleep. 12 hours in the trauma unit, 2 codes. One patient she'd brought back twice and lost on the third. She had the seat reclined and her eyes closed and her phone buzzing on the passenger seat, and for a long moment she just let it buzz. Then she looked at the screen. Unknown number. Iowa area code. She answered it anyway. That was the thing about Petra, she always answered. 14 years of military nursing had trained it into her, that reflex that you pick up because someone on the other end might be bleeding out and every second is the one that mattered. Is this Petra Harlow? The voice was male, flat, careful. Speaking Staff Sergeant Harlow, Army Nurse Corps, Fort Bragg, 2014 through 2019. She sat up slowly. It's civilian now, and it's been a while since anyone used that title. I'm calling about Sergeant First Class Owen Delacroix. The name landed like something physical. Petra hadn't heard it in 3 years. Owen Delacroix, her old unit, the one who'd pulled her out of a vehicle after an IED hit their convoy outside Mosul, the one who'd written her a letter after her medical discharge that she'd read so many times the paper had gone soft at the folds. What happened? She asked. He's been arrested, ma'am. Assault on a police officer. He's asking for you. She drove 4 hours through the dark Iowa cornfields without stopping once. Owen was sitting in a holding cell when they brought her back to see him. He had a split lip and a wrist brace, and the kind of exhaustion on his face that had nothing to do with sleep. He was 41 years old and had 2 Purple Hearts and a TBI he'd been managing for the past 6 years with medication, therapy, and a stubbornness that Petra privately thought was his most effective treatment. You didn't have to come, he said. You called me. I called your voicemail. Same thing. She sat down across from him. Tell me what happened, he told her, slowly, carefully, the way men like Owen always told stories, leaving out the parts where he was scared, leaving out the parts where he felt small. He'd been driving home from his VA appointment in Des Moines. 2-lane road, late evening, the kind of dark you only get in the middle of the country. An officer had pulled him over. Routine stop, he'd thought. He'd pulled over immediately, put both hands on the wheel, had his license and registration ready before the officer even reached the window. The officer's name was Braddock. He asked if I'd been drinking, Owen said. I hadn't. I told him that. He asked me to step out of the vehicle. I asked why. He said he'd observed swerving. Owen looked at his hands. I hadn't been swerving, but I got out. I wasn't going to be that guy. What Braddock hadn't known, or hadn't cared about, was that Owen's TBI caused a vestibular disorder, balance issues. His neurologist had documented it extensively. He walked with a slight list to the right, especially when he was tired, especially after a long drive. He asked me to do the walk and turn, heel to toe. Owen's jaw tightened. I explained. I told him I had a neurological condition from a combat injury, that I had documentation in the car. He told me to stop making excuses. He'd made it 4 steps before his balance gave out. He'd caught himself on the officer's patrol car. Braddock had taken that as resistance. He put me on the ground, Owen said quietly. I didn't fight him. I never fought him. But he put me on the ground. The wrist brace was from where they'd cuffed him while he was down. The split lip was from his face hitting the asphalt. Petra sat with that for a moment. She'd treated soldiers who'd survived things she couldn't imagine. She'd watched them come home and try to rebuild normal lives around damaged nervous systems and fragmented memories, and the particular kind of loneliness that comes from being a person who has seen things other people haven't. She thought about all of them, all those charts, all those hands she'd held in recovery rooms. Has he been charged? She asked. Assault on an officer, resisting arrest. Owen almost laughed. They're saying I lunged at him. Did anyone see it? He looked at her. There was a woman, parked across the road. She'd stopped because she thought there'd been an accident. That woman was named Lourdes Casas. She was 58 years old, a retired schoolteacher, and she had sat in her Subaru with her hazard lights blinking for 11 minutes while she watched what happened on that roadside. She had a phone. She had filmed most of it. Petra found this out from Owen's public defender, a young man named Timothy Sayer, who looked like he hadn't slept since law school and who handed Petra a phone across a laminate table and pressed play. The footage was shaky, lit by the patrol car's overhead lights, the audio compressed and wind-scratched. But it was clear enough. You could see Owen step out of the vehicle with his hands visible. You could see him speak, calm and measured. You could see him attempt the walk test, stumble, reach out. You could see Braddock's reaction, fast, aggressive, out of proportion to what had just happened. You could see the ground. Timothy Sayre said, "The problem is, the DA's office is sitting on this. They've been sitting on it for 6 days. Why?" Braddock has 12 years on the force. His supervisor is the chief's brother-in-law. He paused. And Owen doesn't have anyone in his corner. Petra looked at him. He does now. She went back to her car and sat in the parking lot of the Bremer County Courthouse and called every number she had. It was 8 in the morning. She called the VA patient advocate who'd helped Owen navigate his disability claim. She called a veterans legal aid organization in Des Moines that she'd read about in a newsletter the previous year. She called a journalist, a contact she'd made years before, a woman named Gail Kessner who covered veteran health care for a regional paper and who answered on the second ring and listened without interrupting for 4 minutes. "Send me the video," Gail said. "I don't have it. Get it." Petra went back inside and sat down with Lourdes Casas, who had driven 2 hours that morning because Timothy Sayre had asked her to, and because, as she told Petra over bad courthouse coffee, she had a son who'd done 2 tours in Afghanistan, and she wasn't going to pretend she hadn't seen what she'd seen. She sent the video to Gail Kessner at 9:14 a.m. The story went up at noon. By 3 p.m. it had been shared 11,000 times. Petra didn't let herself feel anything about that yet. She knew better. Attention wasn't justice. Attention was noise, and noise could go in any direction. She'd seen it happen to veterans before, the surge of public sympathy, the quick news cycle, and then the quiet resolution where nothing actually changed and the person at the center of it all was left to navigate the aftermath alone. So she worked. She filed a formal complaint with the Iowa Law Enforcement Review Board. She drove to Owen's apartment with a recorder and spent 2.5 hours documenting his account in his own words. She contacted his neurologist, Dr. Anand Mehta at the VA Medical Center in Iowa City, who agreed to provide a formal statement regarding Owen's vestibular condition, its documented causes, and its documented effects on his gait. "This is exactly the kind of situation we try to prevent," Dr. Mehta told her. "We give our patients documentation for exactly this reason. It should have mattered." "It will," Petra said. She wasn't sure if she believed it, but she said it anyway. The thing about Petra Harlow that most people didn't know, because she didn't talk about it, because it wasn't the kind of thing she put in her biography or her LinkedIn or her professional correspondence, was that she'd been in a situation not entirely unlike Owen's once. Not the same, but close enough in shape that it still lived in her chest like something calcified. She'd been medically separated from the army after the convoy incident. Her left knee had been reconstructed twice. She walked with a cane for 8 months. She'd been at a pharmacy in Fayetteville trying to fill a prescription, and the pharmacist had looked at her, young, female, no uniform, and told her there was a problem with her military insurance. There wasn't. But the problem had taken 4 hours and 3 supervisors and 1 phone call from her commanding officer to resolve, while she'd stood at the counter with her knee throbbing and her paperwork in order and nobody willing to simply look at it. That was a small thing. She knew it was a small thing compared to Owen's situation. But she'd never forgotten the particular feeling of being invisible in a way that was chosen. Of someone deciding, quickly and without much deliberation, that she didn't deserve the benefit of the doubt. She thought about that while she worked. It helped her stay focused. The hearing before the review board was scheduled for a Thursday, 3 weeks after the arrest. By then, the Veterans of Foreign Wars post in Cedar Falls had submitted a letter of support. 2 other veterans from Owen's former unit had driven in from out of state. Dr. Mehta appeared by video, crisp and unequivocal, explaining Owen's condition in terms that left no room for interpretation. Braddock sat at his own table with a union representative and a department attorney. He'd given a statement saying Owen had been erratic and aggressive and had shoved him when he reached for Owen's arm. The dashcam footage from his patrol car, the department had said, was corrupted. Lourdes Casas took the stand. She was a small woman, careful with her words, and she described what she'd seen with the precision of someone who had spent decades explaining things to people who needed to understand them. She said Owen had not lunged. She said Owen had stumbled. She said she had watched a man try to explain something important and be ignored. Then Timothy Sayre played the phone video. The room was quiet in a particular way, the kind of quiet that happens when people are watching something they already knew was true become undeniable. Braddock's attorney asked if the video could have been misleadingly edited. Lourdes looked at her phone, then at the attorney. "I recorded it," she said. "I didn't edit anything. I don't know how." There was a short recess after that. When they came back, the board chair, a woman named Commissioner Aldana, asked Braddock directly why he had not reviewed Owen's documentation when it was offered. Braddock said Owen had seemed agitated and he'd been concerned for his own safety. Commissioner Aldana asked what specific behavior had caused that concern. Braddock said Owen had raised his voice. Timothy Sayre played the audio from the phone video. The sound quality was poor, but Owen's voice was audible throughout, measured, controlled. The voice of a man who had been trained not to escalate under pressure. There was another silence. Petra sat in the gallery and looked at her hands and did not let her face show what she was feeling. The charges against Owen were dropped the following week. The DA's office cited insufficient evidence, which was not the same as admitting what had actually happened, but Petra had learned to take what was available. The formal complaint against Braddock was sustained. He was placed on administrative leave pending a full departmental review. Gail Kessner wrote a follow-up piece. This one ran in 3 outlets. It included interviews with 2 other veterans who'd had documented neurological or mobility conditions and been subjected to field sobriety testing without accommodation. It included a quote from a policy researcher at Georgetown who'd been studying this exact gap in law enforcement training for 6 years. It included a quote from Petra. She'd been careful about what she said. She wasn't someone who sought attention. But Gail had asked her one question that she'd found she couldn't not answer. Why does this keep happening? Petra had thought about it for a long moment before she spoke. Because the systems aren't built to see the whole person, she said. They're built to react to what's visible in the first 30 seconds. And a lot of what veterans are dealing with isn't visible in the first 30 seconds. It takes more than 30 seconds to see someone. She hadn't expected that to be the thing that traveled, but it did. It was put on signs outside the Bremer County Courthouse when community members gathered the following Saturday. It was read aloud at a state legislative committee hearing on law enforcement training standards 2 months later. Petra wasn't there for most of it. She was back in Minnesota by then, back at the hospital, back in her scrubs. She was there for Owen's first PT session with a new vestibular specialist because she'd made some calls and gotten him in 6 weeks ahead of the normal wait time, and she wanted to see him walk through that door. He walked through it without a list. Better, she said. Week 3, he said. You should see week 8. She laughed. It was the first time she'd laughed in what felt like a long time. The departmental review concluded 4 months later. Braddock was terminated. The union filed a grievance. The arbitration took another 8 months and produced a decision that upheld the termination. The department was required to implement mandatory training on medical accommodations and documented disabilities as part of the settlement. It wasn't everything. Petra knew it wasn't everything. There were other Braddocks. There were other Owens pulled over on other dark roads in other states, without a Lourdes Casas parked across the way with a charged phone. She knew that. She thought about it more than she probably should have. But she also thought about the legislative committee hearing, which she eventually did attend, because Owen asked her to, and because she'd learned that sometimes you had to be in the room even when it was uncomfortable. She sat in the 3rd row and listened to a state senator named Harkins, a veteran himself, 2 terms in the Marine Corps, read her quote back into the legislative record. It takes more than 30 seconds to see someone, he said. That has to be the standard. The bill passed committee. It moved to the full chamber. It was amended 3 times and scaled back in ways that frustrated everyone who'd worked on it, but the core provision remained. Mandatory training, statewide, for all law enforcement officers on interacting with individuals with documented neurological and mobility conditions. Annual recertification. It wasn't enough, but it was a beginning. Owen called her the night the governor signed it. He didn't say much. He wasn't a person who said much. He just said her name, and then he said, "Thank you." And then there was a long silence that was the kind of silence that means something. You did this, Petra told him. We did it, he said, and Lords, and that lawyer who hadn't slept in 4 years. She laughed again. She was getting better at that. Petra Harlow kept the newspaper clipping from Gail Kessner's first article in the pocket of her scrub jacket for a long time. Not because she needed to be reminded of what happened. She wasn't going to forget any of it. But because it had a photograph. Owen, standing outside the courthouse after the charges were dropped, squinting in the afternoon light. He wasn't smiling. He didn't look triumphant. He looked like a man who was very tired and was still standing anyway. She knew what that looked like. She'd seen it in the mirror. On the nights when the trauma unit was quiet enough and the parking lot was empty enough, and she was too tired to drive but too wired to sleep, she'd sit in her car and sometimes take the clipping out and look at it. Not always, just sometimes. She thought about what it meant to serve. The obvious version, the uniform, the deployment, the medals. And then the version that came after, which was quieter and less celebrated and longer, which was just continuing to show up for people. Driving 4 hours in the dark, sitting across a laminate table, calling everyone you knew. She'd been a soldier. Then she'd been a patient. Then she'd been a nurse. And sometimes, when the situation required it, she was something harder to name. The person who showed up because nobody else was going to. The person who looked at what was happening and said, "Not this time." The sun came up over the parking lot the way it always did. Shift change. New patients. The day beginning again. Petra put the clipping away, started the car, and drove home.